This podcast was made on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Woiwurrung and the Bunurong. We'd like to pay respects to their elders, past and present, and emerging. From the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, this is PsychTalks.
Hello and welcome to another round of PsychTalks. I'm Nick Haslam.
And I'm Cassie Hayward. We're your hosts and we're just itching to deep dive into more fascinating research in psychology and neuroscience. This season of PsychTalks is already halfway, so if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any episodes.
Today we're talking with Dr. Frank Molliker. Frank studies the wonders of human language, what it tells us about how we think and how we interact with the world around us. His research crisscrosses numerous cultural and linguistic settings, and it also has a lot to say about the horror of legal language. Let's get into it. Welcome, Frank.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Frank, you describe yourself as a computational cognitive scientist. And now that might be unfamiliar to some of our listeners. So what does it mean? And can you explain what cognitive science is and what's computational about your approach to it?
Yeah. So cognitive science is an interdisciplinary field. It mixes anthropology, computer science, linguistics, neuroscience, philosophy, and of course, psychology. We study the mind like a computer, right? What are the mental representations and processes, the computer program, basically, that explains human reasoning? So I'm a computational cognitive scientist. I spend most of my time translating between these two fields and basically taking the theories and the insights from these fields and putting them into math. And then, formalizing the math, making nice testable predictions that, I then go out and find collaborators or go out into the field and test with large data normally.
As you've said, the focus of your research is language, but you talk about it as a cognitive technology. What do you mean by that?
Okay. So a cognitive technology, I guess at the simplest level, it's a tool. For example, language and number are cognitive technologies, right? We invented that. That's our fault. Right? Like we have littered the world with linguistic structure and numerical structure, and then we learn from it and we use it to achieve these goals. And importantly, with these cognitive technologies, we learn them, right? We learn them as kids. We use them to, achieve different goals, whether it's, math or whether it's communication, right? And that leaves extra structure in the world that other people learn from. And additionally, we teach these things, right? We explicitly teach people number. We explicitly teach people, right, like language, right? And through this repeated pattern of learning and teaching, we culturally evolve optimal solutions to our problems, right, that help us to achieve our goals. And these actually allows us to flexibly adapt to the environment in ways that biological evolution wouldn't allow us to.
This is so interesting because the idea that language is shaped by culture is sort of intuitive to most of us. The idea that, different languages split up the world in different kind of ways. But I remember back in the dark ages when I was studying language, the emphasis was much more on universals, on how all languages are, if you like, built from the same building blocks. So can you give us an example? Say colour words. How do different cultures or languages, if you like, break up the colour space?
Yeah. So color is this fun case, right? We all can perceive the same colors if we have normal vision, right? We can distinguish, the eggshell white from the white. But different languages of the world, they don't have a vocabulary that's that rich, right? The basic color terms, the ones that we use every day, right? Not the eggshell, off-white, mauve, turquoise, right? There's only a finite inventory of these basic color terms. English has about 11, right? Blue, yellow, pink, purple. But other languages have fewer and some languages have more. So, for example, Agarabi, a language to speak in Papua New Guinea, that only has about 5 color terms that everyone would use, right? They use like blue, green, yellow, red, and dark or black. Whereas other languages like Mexican Spanish, for example, has 2 blues. They have a celeste, kind of sky blue, and then the rest of what an English person would call blue. Similarly, Russian also has 2 blues, except they carve it up differently. They have like the blue that, generally English people would, agree is blue, but then they carve off a bit that's like a navy blue. It's darker.
So interesting. So I guess part of what a computational cognitive scientist might do is see whether there are principles underlying these differences, right? So one of the ones you refer to, I think, when you talk about this stuff is a principle of efficiency. So what do you mean by efficiency and how do you show that languages are efficient or not?
Yeah. So this is the day job, right? Figuring out what are these underlying principles that can explain like all of this variation. We've optimally solved these goals, right? We've come up with these efficient structures like language or number, right? But how do we get there? And so one thing I want to clarify is that goals don't always go in the same direction, right? So let's take, for example, a listener. A listener's goal might be to hear a word and then be able to identify any object in the world, right? So if I give you a word that can point to exactly the object that's intended, an optimal language from a listener's perspective is a language where every possible state of the world has its own unique word, right? So that means we have a unique word for all 621 Marvel universes and every single item inside them, right? Impossible. We can't do that, especially because if you think about what a speaker's goal is, a speaker wants to be able to choose the word as quickly and accurately as possible that's going to get their listener to understand, right? They don't want to search memory through an infinite, amount of words in order to figure out what's the right word that would get my speaker to understand what I'm talking about. They have only a finite memory. They want it to be quick. A speaker's optimal language would essentially be one word, right? Ba. And when I say ba, it means whatever I intended as a speaker to mean. So all of my intentions, just one word, ba. I don't have to think about it, right? Now, of course, neither of these languages actually work, right? We call them degenerate languages. But real languages have to figure out how to trade off these two goals. And how they choose to budget these goals defines a sort of efficiency trade-off, right? It defines a trade-off between these two pressures, one for simplicity. We don't want a language that blows up in like a vocabulary, right? But also informativity. We want all of the new words that we add to be useful, right? To help us identify the things that we care about. And so languages of the world tend to efficiently optimize this trade-off. Right, each language gets to choose how it wants to budget and spend on, this much complexity for this much informativity. And what's interesting is we can build these computational models off of these two principles that define all of the different ways that you could budget between informativity and simplicity. And when you do that, you get a whole variety, a sort of trade-off Pareto frontier of possible ways that languages could be, right? They could solve this problem. And all of the existing languages for something like color tend to fall exactly near this boundary, suggesting that every language is indeed efficiently solving this problem. They're balancing their goals, but they all pick how they want to budget, which goal do I prefer more or prioritize more differently. And that actually characterizes the diversity that we see in the world.
Is it just about efficiency, or does it shape how we see the world? I had to chuckle when you talked about the Marvel Universe, because I feel like I've learned a whole new language over the past few years as my kids become obsessed with soccer. So I've learned a whole new words, new everything. Am I changing the way I see the world with that?
So I would argue that language definitely changes how you see the world. But it's not in like the Arrival, the movie kind of way, where if you learn the alien language, right, suddenly you can time travel, right? And it's also not in the perceptual kind of way where like, my language has two color words for blue. Now I can, see blues differently because we can all see, the shades of blues the same, right? We can all distinguish between them. But what language does do is it points attention on all of the structure in the world, and it highlights what's important. Right? What's going to be useful distinctions for later things in learning, right? Language is a primary tool for social transmission, right? This core thing where if we're going to culturally evolve good, optimal solutions for, our different goals, then we need to be able to transmit it. So like, for one example, to give you, to make this concrete, is if we think about like kinship terms, right? Kinship terms, everybody has a family tree, right? Kinship terms are things like mother and brother and whatnot. So everyone has a family tree, but it's invisible. You don't see it, right? Like it's latent. If you're a kid and you're trying to figure out what your kinship terms are, you have to figure out basically just from the words as highlighting different people what the underlying relationships are. And these underlying relationships can have different goals that they're made to achieve that you don't actually pay attention to or even see when you're a kid. For example, we can think about the Yanomamo tribe. These are people that live in the Amazon rainforest, right? Whereas English doesn't separate cousins, your mother's brothers, your father's brothers, your mother's sisters, your father's brothers' kids, they all get the same term. They're all your cousin, right? In Yanomamo, they actually care about whether you're a parallel cousin or a cross cousin. So a parallel cousin is your mother's sister's kids, your father's brother's kids, right? A cross cousin is your mother's brother's kids or your father's sister's kids, right? And so kids at a very young age have to learn, the difference between these two different groupings, right? And this, for a kid, it can seem very arbitrary. It's a nice genealogical relationship. It exists. You can look at it on the tree, right? But like, why? And it turns out that these kind of relationships actually have more to do with, in this case, in mating, for example, where it's tough to find, a potential mate in these kind of tribal places, right? And so this community solves that by having preferential marriages to cross cousins when they're mate limited. So your cross cousins are potentially future mates. But this doesn't matter to a kid, right? Like a kid who's learning this language is not going, who am I mating? They're a kid, right? So without language, you wouldn't be able to be aware of these kind of distinctions like early on. And these kind of distinctions can highlight or build structures that, are useful for other goals later on in life.
That's so interesting. And so you've given us an explanation for why the Yanomamo might have a different way of dividing up kinship than we do here. What's the reason why, just going back to colour, why Russians would divide blue in a different way from Mexicans, and why we English folk don't?
So this is a nice question. I don't know if I'm going to have a satisfying answer. The answer that I would suggest, or I'd go with, hypothesize at the moment, is that if we want to communicate about things informatively, right, that means that we need to know how often we need to talk about, or this particular tool, in this case, this word, is going to be useful at achieving our goal. And so if you look at the different parts of the color space, what we want to do is we want to normally identify things by color, right? And so if there are things that are important to identify by color, right, that's how we're going to carve up our color space so that we can be more precise and have harder edges around those specific cases.
So it's sort of adapted to the local cultural or ecological or something environmental
context? Yes, ideally it would be adapted. Exactly, it would be adapted to the local context. So, for example, if you look at places that are tropical, have lots of rainforest, green vibes, lots of bright, vibrant colors, they tend to split the color space so that they make really clear these bright, colorful, poisonous amphibians that you should not touch versus things that are okay to touch and interact with.
So another aspect of language you've studied, and you brought this up in relation to the kinship terms a little bit, is how language is acquired. And you were involved in some fascinating work, again in South America, on the development of mathematical knowledge and number concepts in particular among Indigenous people in that region. Can you tell us a bit about that work and what it showed? Yeah.
So I was lucky enough to be able to collaborate with some people who are working in Bolivia with the Chimane people. The Chimane are hunter-gatherers. It's a hunter-gatherer society. They live not far from La Paz along a river. So what we're interested in is primarily numerical development. And what's fun is that the Chimane language has a base 10 counting system, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then it sort of resets, right? A lot of other industrialized societies also have, a base counting system, right? Any English 2-year-old can sing that song for you. They know how to count like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The interesting thing, though, is that while a 2-year-old can count that, 2-year-olds don't actually know what those words mean. So if you put a pile of cookies in front of the same 2-year-old who just counted to 10 for you and ask them, can I have 3 cookies? Right? You're just as likely to get the entire pile of cookies as you are to get however many fit in their hand, and certainly not 3. Right? Kids learn number words in stages. First, they learn what the meaning of 1 is. They can hand you 1 cookie exactly. Then they learn what the meaning of 2 is, right? So they can hand you 1 or 2 cookies, but you ask them for 3, you still get that handful. Then they become 3 knowers and they figure out what 3 means. Sometimes you see kids that are 4 knowers, so they know what 4 means. But what's really cool is that we don't have 5 knowers, right? By the time that a kid would be a 5 knower, right, they just figure it out. They figured out the algorithm. They can now count. So however many numbers that they can count to, they can now as accurately as they can count, they can hand you that many cookies, right? What's really cool is this happens in all industrialized societies that have a base 10 counting system. It takes a couple of years, right? We see this in Japan. We see this in Hebrew, Arabic, every language that we have data for, right? Kids go through this stage of development, 1 knower, 2 knower, 3 knower, 4 knower. We want to know, hunter-gatherer society, Chimane kids, do they show the same pattern, right? They also have a base 10 system, but, very different from these industrialized societies that we have data for. So my collaborators basically went and looked at the Chimane children, and we found out that, yes, they do go through this exact same pattern. They go 1 knower, 2 knower, 3 knower, 4 knower, and then eventually they figure out the algorithm. What's really cool is we recently did a meta-analysis, and it turns out that the cardinal principal knowers, the kids that figured out the algorithm, they all have some formal schooling. And formal schooling among the Chimane is actually really recent, and it's not formal schooling like an industrialized society. It's much more like, when the government can provide aid, they have a teacher who comes and they teach the Chimane kids in Spanish. And so the instruction is in Spanish, and it's very recent. But only the kids with formal schooling have, at least in our data set, have acquired that full counting ability. But what's really cool is that there are Chimanes that are adults that, did not have any of this formal schooling, and they can count, right? And so we wanted to figure out, how did they figure it out, right? They didn't have formal schooling. So is formal schooling actually required, right? And so the anthropologist on our team, David O'Shea-Hennessy, went to go find adults that, might not have had the experience of formal schooling, but they might have had mathematical experience elsewhere. They might have done trade, right? So the Chimane do trade with other people, right? And the trade language is sort of Spanish because that's the lingua franca of Bolivia, right? And what they found, what Dave, when he went there, he found out that basically these people, maybe they can't exactly count, but they can do trade. And so he found this really cool group of people who could do mathematical computations that were necessary for trade. So, for example, in the Chimane society, basically trade works in 5s. You have these hatata leaves that they trade, or sometimes they'll trade like a bunch of bananas or plantains if they're in the right sort of amount, like for a cluster. They basically group them in 5, and they do multiples of 5 is like the trade. So if you ask these people, 5 times 2, 5 times 3, times 4, fine. 10 plus 5, fine. 3 plus 4, no idea, wrong, right? 2 plus 5, nope. Right, so they figured out enough math. They figured out math that works specifically for them, for the goals that they're trying to achieve, right? And I think that's why, I guess, numerical cognition is such a great idea, or such a great example of these cognitive technologies, right? These technologies that are customly adapted to our goals, right? If the only thing that I really need to do is trade in multiples of 5, I'm going to learn math in multiples of 5, right? Like, why learn that 1 plus 1 stuff? And I mean, this isn't the first time an anthropologist has found a result. If you look back, Jeff Sachs has worked with Brazilian candy sellers during periods of inflation, where if you're trying to sell candy in massive periods of inflation, these like 6 to 10-year-old boys would basically be trying to sell candy at the public transportation stops, right? But you wouldn't know, like, how much am I actually going to need to cost these things, because the price changes rapidly over the course of a day, right? So you have to sort of really quickly offhand make some heuristics that, in this case, use magnitude comparisons to figure out how you should price your candy so that you have enough to buy tomorrow's box of candy and that you still make a profit, right? And when you compare these, like non-schooled Brazilian candy sellers to, people of equivalent socioeconomic status with schooling, or even the kids that have, like a good socioeconomic status and, schooling, they're better at these abstract magnitude comparisons than their peers, right? They can't do the formal counting thing that they would teach you in school, but it's like they can teach you what they needed, right? And they're better at it. So these kind of things really are adapted. Cognitive technologies are really adapted to what we need to do.
I think they're such fascinating examples of how efficient language can be, but also so adapted to the goals that you need in that scenario. But you've also done research on a type of language that's spectacularly inefficient. Can you tell us about legalese?
Yes. Legalese is notorious, right? What do I really have to say? Legalese is difficult in so many different ways. Rather than just saying a clean sentence, legalese likes to take a sentence and throw it in the middle of the other sentence, right? For example, the contractor who knowingly and in sound mind and good conscience entered this employment agreement upon termination of their employment at either the employer or their behest will be entitled to a one-time payout of $100 million. It's a golden parachute clause that I just made up, right? So when you have that clause that's a big, long sentence, but it's actually two sentences where they just threw one right in the middle, right? The outer sentence is that the contractor is entitled to a one-time payout of $100 million, right, upon termination of their employment at either their employer or their own behest, right? But then we entered this other sentence, the contractor is in sound mind and good conscience and when they entered this agreement, right? Why did that need to be in the middle of this other sentence? It's memory taxing. Legalese isn't fun. It's a tax on memory. But also, legalese uses these rare words that we never see anywhere else. Mens rea, mens sana. Or even simple things. If you look at your real estate agreement in a lot of different languages, right? Why do we call it lessee instead of renter? Renter is much more frequent. Everyone knows what a renter is. What is a lessee?
Is it all the complexity required because legal concepts are themselves extremely intricate, or are they just trying to confuse us?
Great question. So we've actually looked at this in work with my grad student, Eric Martinez and Ted Gibson at MIT. We basically asked a whole bunch of lawyers, right? We gave them contracts that were written in sort of plain English, then we gave them contract excerpts that are written in legalese. And we asked them, are they both equally enforceable? Right? Do they have the same legal content? Do they have the same legal standing? Right? And overwhelmingly, they do. Right? Plain English equivalents do exist. It's possible. So there's nothing about the concepts that make these things complex because I can easily undo them just by taking sentences outside of other sentences, using slightly more frequent words.
So if language tends to become more efficient over time, surely over time legalese has also become more efficient.
You would think that. No, we've actually also looked at this. So in a study, I guess last year now, we looked at the entire U.S. legal code. And I should say, so far, we've only ever looked at U.S. laws, right? It might be different in other laws, and we're looking at that now. But so far, we've only just looked at U.S. legal code. And if you look at the entirety of the U.S. legal code up to about 2022, right, and you can find other texts that are comparable. We can look at like fiction from the exact same time periods, right? Or even academic text with all of their weird jargon and whatnot from the exact same time period. And we can actually look at, how prevalent are these really hard to process linguistic structures, this kind of center embedding where you take sentences and throw them into other sentences, or the frequency of words. And if we look across all of this time, legalese is always containing more of these difficult to process structures than any of the other control tests. This is despite calls for, reform in like the 1970s and even the Plain Writing Act, Plain Language Act of 2010.
I do hope, Frank, that we don't get sued for talking about all of this, and probably we should be even-handed and start talking about that jargon in psychology you mentioned. But if legal language isn't getting more plain and more straightforward over time, what is the obstacle? And what does it tell us about how we should be trying to increase the use of plain language?
Yeah. So whenever you're trying to change something that exists and has this kind of structural momentum, it's really hard to just overcome momentum. It's so much easier to just copy this template and use it on the next document, right? Similarly, there's very few structural changes that really incentivize using simpler language, right? There's no reason to use legal language is going to change people's financial end goals, basically. It's harder to change something that already has momentum when there's no clear incentive to do so. And so we have to change the incentive structure of institutions if we want to actually see results.
It reminds me how kids have their own language. Every kind of generation have their own words for what's cool and what's not. Is it just so they have their own little kind of way of speaking that other people aren't allowed in to understand?
So when we did that study with the lawyers, we actually asked them this exact same question. We were, interested to see if maybe it's just an in-group bias. So it's like you're going to signal that you're a good lawyer, and so you're going to use your jargon to do that. And it turns out it's not. The lawyers would equally hire or equally work with people who use the plain language alternatives versus legalese alternatives. What we actually think keeps legalese going this way is actually something called performativity. Is this idea that language in legalese isn't just describing something. Normally when we use language, we're trying to communicate. We're just trying to describe a state of the world. When we use legalese, we're actually changing the state of the world, right? I am now placing with this legal language an obligation over you or some kind of right or something upon you, right? The same way where you like crack a wine bottle over a ship and you say like, I now christen you the whatever, and you've now named it, you've changed the state of the world. Or when a priest says, I now pronounce you man and wife, right? And you're now married. The world is this change and this kind of performativity, right, is the same kind of thing that happens in legalese. And so we see this kind of performativity also in somewhere else. We see this in magic spells. Right. Magic spells are also supposed to change the world by just, words themselves. And magic spells also use language to signal that they're doing it. Right. So your magic spell is supposed to use some archaic language, or it's supposed to rhyme. Right. That's how you know that it's a magic spell. Well, our current hypothesis is that with legal language, it's basically the same thing, except the structure isn't rhyming or archaic language, or maybe it is some archaic words, but it's throwing sentences in other sentences and being complicated. And that sets it apart. That gives it sort of legal weight in people's minds, not in any sort of evaluative body of the law.
Fascinating stuff. So look, Frank, on a final note, I've got a bone to pick with you about an old paper of yours where you said that English speakers have learned only about 1.5 megabytes of linguistic information, which for listeners of my age will remember a 5.25-inch floppy disk from the 80s would hold. I mean, surely clever people like Cassie and I know more than that.
I mean, it's true. Like, clearly people know more than just, the save icon worth of information about language. But when we look at language and we talk about the linguistic forms of words, right, and how things combine, that's actually really small. One save icon, one floppy disk contains all the information that you actually need about language and how it combines the actual structures and forms. The part that really, takes up most of the space, even on the floppy disk, is the semantics, what words mean, right? It's the part that makes the large language models large. They're supposed to be world knowledge or something like that. But that's, separate from language. It's not knowledge about language. And even in our estimate, that's the vast majority of the information that you need to learn about a language is semantics. It's word meanings.
I feel like I need a whole floppy disk size memory of the offside rule in soccer, which I will never understand. But
yes.
Frank, the work you do probably isn't necessarily the first thing people think of when they think about psychology, but I think it really shines a light on how we think and learn and speak and interact. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure.
And that wraps up this episode of PsychTalks. A big thank you to our guest, Dr. Frank Mollica, for sharing his insights. This episode was produced by Carly Godden with support from Mairead Murray and Gemma Papril. Sound engineering by Jack Palmer. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.